Good day and welcome to another edition of Insight. I'm Michael Sharp. On a recent trip to the United States, Insight sat down with civil rights attorney Jonathan Moore, who was featured in several major trials involving civil rights abuses.
Eric Garner on July 17, 2014 was a 43-year-old man who had 4 kids, a wife, was making a living on the street, selling loose cigarettes, helping people out. He used to be at a same location on Bay Street in Staten Island, New York, and he was well known to the police as somebody who did that. You could argue that what he was doing was illegal, but on the other hand, here's a man, like a lot of people, just trying to make a living, support his family, and he did. Supported 4 kids.
And what happened on that fatal day?
On July 17th, the police had received a report that an individual was selling loose cigarettes on Bay Street, which is in downtown Staten Island. A supervisor sent Officer Pantaleo and another officer to respond to the scene. They came across Eric Garner. They knew Eric Garner. They had arrested Eric Garner before. And even though they did not personally observe him committing any crime, based upon the report, the direction from their supervisor, they decided to arrest Mr. Garner. You can imagine how surprised he was, having not done nothing wrong, why these officers would want to arrest him. And he protested, as many people do when they feel like they're being unjustly targeted for police action. He was subsequently taken to the ground, subjected to the use of an illegal chokehold, and died at the scene from a combination of both neck and chest compression. Neck compression from the chokehold, chest compression from Pantaleo and other officers being on his back and making it impossible for him to breathe. Thus, 11 times with a failing voice, he said, "I can't breathe," until he could breathe no longer.
How did you become involved with it, and what are the recent decisions?
Well, my firm and I have been involved in police abuse cases, both in New York and nationally, for many, many years. We had, in 2014, just successfully completed the civil action involving the Central Park Five, 5 young men who were falsely accused of a brutal rape and attempted murder in Central Park on April 19th, 1989, and had served many years in jail before they were finally exonerated. We brought that case on behalf of the survivors, the 5 young men who were falsely convicted, litigated it for over 10 years, and settled it in 2014 for a total of $45 million.
As it relates to Eric Garner, some recent decisions have come up as it relates to the policeman. I think there was a case in court. Well, explain that to us.
This is where the criminal justice system failed. The people of the city of New York, and more importantly, the Garner family. On July 17th, Eric Garner was dead. He was dead as a result of police activity. Yet the police really did nothing to investigate that crime, because it was a crime committed by police officers. So through a combination of cooperation by the local district attorney, the failure of the federal government to step in, both the Obama and the Trump administration to step in and bring a federal civil rights claim, and the failure of really the police department itself to adequately and promptly investigate. The officers, almost except for one, have had no adverse consequences. The one officer, Daniel Pantaleo, who was identified in the video, remember this is not simply an allegation. There was a video that showed all of this going on. The officer who was identified as having applied the chokehold was eventually fired, but it took 5 years for him to be fired. And during those 5 years, he was on desk duty, getting his pay. In fact, he was getting overtime for many of those years. So in those 5 years, while the family suffered, Officer Pantaleo got over $500,000.
And a decision was taken only recently. What that decision was, and what are the implications for further this case going on further?
Yeah, well, with respect to what happened with Pantaleo recently, there was eventually a administrative trial within the department to determine whether he should be disciplined. Officer Pantaleo had a trial. Witnesses were put on by the police department who testified that he applied an illegal chokehold, and the administrative law judge who decided the case, in fact, found that he had violated rules and regulations of the police department and decided he should be fired. That decision is a recommendation made to the police commissioner, James O'Neill, and then approximately 30 days after that decision was made, James O'Neill decided to fire Daniel Pantaleo. So he's no longer a police officer, and he lost most of his pension. He kept what he contributed, but he lost what the city would have contributed. He was a 13-year veteran of the police department.
Does the Garner family feel as if that's enough?
No, there is no justice in this case for the Garner family. First of all, their loved one died, and nobody was punished criminally for that. Even though if you look at the video, it's clear that Officer Pantaleo used an illegal chokehold. You can make a strong case as to that being a violation of his civil rights because, one, he used an illegal chokehold. Two, they lied about it. The medical examiner concluded that it was a combination of neck and chest compression. So, in fact, not only could you conclude that Pantaleo had been guilty of a crime, you could conclude that several of the officers who were involved in it also committed a crime and should have been at a minimum fired. And for what should have happened is that they all should have been prosecuted for a federal civil rights violation, but they were not.
You alluded earlier to the 5 young men who were eventually exonerated for a rape in Central Park. To what extent were you involved in that?
Well, I was the lead lawyer on the civil case, developing the evidence that we eventually came in possession of to show that it was clear beyond any shadow of a doubt, even though that wasn't the burden, but it was clear that these 5 young men were wrongfully prosecuted and that the police department and the district attorney's office at the time knew or reasonably should have known that they were in fact innocent. And we developed that evidence through many years of discovery and doing depositions and of the police officers involved. And at one point, eventually in 2014, a new mayor came on the scene, Bill de Blasio, who was, people have various criticisms of Mayor de Blasio now, but in 2014 he did the right thing and decided he wanted to resolve that case, and so we negotiated the eventual settlement of that case.
I can't help but thinking so far we've been talking about some black people, African Americans as we call. Is that a trend?
It's unfortunately a trend. Unfortunately, the targets of police abuse are primarily, if not overwhelmingly, Black and Latinx in our country. Although it does happen on occasion that other people are subjected to police abuse, it's primarily a problem in the Black and Latin communities.
If I recall, then Citizen Trump had things to say about this. What exactly was that, and how did that play out in the case?
Well, we've known about the character of Mr. Trump for a lot of years. We knew about it way back when he was sued for housing discrimination by preventing Blacks and Latinx people from applying for residence in his housing developments. But it was really crystal clear in the early 1989, right after this case occurred, the Central Park case occurred, what his true character was when he took out a full-page ad in all the local newspapers saying these kids are guilty and they should get the death penalty. Unfortunately, we don't have the death penalty, but it should be reinstated even for juveniles. You have to remember, only one of the 5 was 16. The other 2 were either 14, or the other 4 were either 14 or 15. So here's a man calling for the death penalty for essentially kids not out of grammar school yet. And so a horrible moment in history for which he has never apologized and refuses to apologize.
I don't know if you have noted or done any follow-up or heard of how are they doing, this Central Park 5. Did they get their lives back together? And I say that with a lot of strange meanings.
Yeah, you never recover from something like that. You never get your life. The ultimate remedy would have to be rewind time and then not have to go through that. That's of course impossible. They have all done very well though since the exoneration and since we brought the civil suit to a conclusion. They're all very active in working for other people who have been wrongfully convicted and trying to get justice for those folks. They work very close with a group called the Innocence Project, which is a nationally known organization that fights against wrongful convictions. So they've all done amazingly well. And the thing that it makes you stop and wonder, how could these young kids, they lost their youth. They spent from the age 14 to age 21 in prison, missing holidays and school and whatever, everything that normal kids take for granted. How could they not come out bitter? Well, the reason they didn't come out so bitter was because, one, they knew they were innocent and they fought for their innocence throughout the time. And 2, they had an abiding faith in God, and they had a strong family tradition. All of them, all these young kids none of them had ever been involved in the criminal justice system. These were kids who were literally in the park that night at the wrong place at the wrong time. And to this enduring shame of the city of New York, what they did to these kids was say, we're going to make this case out of those kids. I don't care what the evidence is.
Mm-hmm. Did they ever find out who was responsible for that?
Absolutely, and that's part of why we can sit here today and with a better conclusion to this terrible incident was in 2002, the person who was actually responsible for that crime came forward. He was already in prison on a series of rapes and murders. So he didn't come forward to us, to some investigator we hired or whatever. He came forward to prison officials and said, "I have this terrible burden on my soul. I want to lift it." And he said, "I was the person who committed this crime,"
which was rape, wasn't it?
It was
murder.
a rape, sodomy, brutal sexual assault. She was battered on the head with a brick. She lost some huge percentage of her blood. It was a horrendous crime. The reason it was investigated by homicide detectives is that they was almost certain she was going to die. She didn't, thank God. So she was a victim. Clearly, these kids were a victim. But Reyes this was the 4th of 9, a series of 9 rapes, murders, and assaults that took place in the park in the winter of '88, the spring of '89. Had the police done their job, they could have prevented 5 additional rapes and murders. And those are the other victims of this terrible event. In fact, they knew who had done it. They had identified this person. His name is Mateus Reyes, because he had been accused of a rape in the park, very close to where this rape took place, of a young white woman who was looked almost a spitting image of Patricia Mealy, who was the victim of the Central Park case. She had been raped 2 days earlier, April 17th. And they were able to, through doing basic detective work, which they didn't do in the Central Park case, they were able to identify Reyes as a suspect. They had his picture, they had his address, they had his name. They knew where he had gone for medical treatment as a result of being scratched by the woman on April 17th. Yet all of a sudden on April 19th, when this event happened, his name drops off. So, and it's not heard of again until 2002.
Yes. Let's take a break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Insight. We're speaking to a civil rights attorney out of New York. And now we focus on a case closer to home. Consider being put in jail for a crime you didn't commit. Here's a story of a Jamaican 16-year-old in the United States.
The issue of wrongful conviction is an enduring problem in the United States. Since 1992, the Innocence Project alone has exonerated 365 people, including 22 people on death row, who have been exonerated mostly through the use of DNA, but sometimes simply through hard and good investigative work. That's a lot of people who were in jail who should not have been in jail. One of those individuals is an individual named Hugh Burton, who in January of 1989, 3 months before the Central Park case started, had gone to school that day on January 3rd, and came home to find his mother bludgeoned dead in her bedroom. He called 911. The police came. They took his story. They released him to his aunt in Mount Vernon. He went up there. And then 2 or 3 days later, they came and arrested him and charged him with the killing of his mother, who was from Jamaica. The father, Raphael, was also Jamaican. He was in Jamaica at the time. So imagine the horror of learning not only that your wife has been killed, but that your son is accused of it. This is another example of how the police use improper coercion, intimidation, pressure to resolve a case, and then once they're committed to that story, they will not back off of it because it may reflect badly on their police work. And it took Hugh Burton 30 years before he was exonerated, and only last February, this past February, did in a joint motion agreed to by the Bronx District Attorney's Office with the lawyers from the Innocence Project, they dismissed the indictment, vacated the conviction, and fully exonerated him. He had been paroled after 21 years, so 21 of those 30 years he spent in prison, various state prisons in New York, as a lifer. Now you have to understand, at age 16 he was treated as an adult, and so he went into adult prison at age 16, where he spent the next 21 years. And so we are bringing a case on behalf of Mr. Burton. There's strong evidence that this was a conviction that was faulty. There was strong evidence that the District Attorney's Office, the Bronx District Attorney's Office, withheld evidence that was exculpatory, in other words, which would have shown the innocence of Mr. Burton, including the fact, for instance, that they had information from his teacher that he had been at school during the time of the attack, and they withheld that information from the defense. And they had detectives involved who, as we began to discover, were engaged in a series of wrongful prosecutions in the Bronx at that time. Again, you're talking about 1989, the height of the crack epidemic, murder rates higher than ever, and the pressure on the police to solve cases becomes so overwhelming that they do it in contravention to their obligation, their duty, the vow they take to do justice. And we're going to do our best to go after we are suing these district attorney, these detectives. 2 or 3 of them are still alive, and we're suing the district attorney as well.
When you say you're suing them, you in fact are suing the state.
Well, we're doing
the city.
both. We're suing the individual police officers and the district attorney for violating Mr. Burton's federal civil rights, which is often referred to in the United States as a 1983 action, Section 1983 action under the federal civil rights statutes. We also, in New York, like some states, but not all states, has a wrongful conviction statute that if you're exonerated and you can show that you didn't do anything to contribute to your conviction, and you can show that you're innocent, all of which we would satisfy here, we believe, you are then awarded some amount of money, not as much as you could get in the federal civil rights case, but some amount of money as compensation for your wrongful conviction.
21 years in prison,
Yes.
where he spent time defending himself. Did he ever get a chance to mourn the death of his mother?
Yeah,
He was arrested 2 days after. Normally we cry.
yeah. He's never had the opportunity really to, mourn his mother or his father. His father, who, spent all his worldly goods, all his wealth, trying to find the best representation for his son in a criminal case, trying to get him out on appeal, doing everything he can, died in that process, and Hugh was not even allowed out of prison to go to his funeral.
How is he doing?
Hugh Burton's a remarkable man. Another example of somebody who, because they know they're innocent and they believe in themselves and they understand that if they don't, it's going to be like a cancer that's going to eat them up, did remarkably well in prison. He's a wonderful human being. And he has become, quite ironically, maybe not so ironically, a marathon runner.
Marathon runner. Tell me about that.
He learned early on from looking at the other lifers that they used to run around the perimeter of the prison all the time, and as a way of sort of, I guess, really sort of, drowning out the pain of this process and of being incarcerated, which is never, and under any circumstances, is never a good thing. Certainly in an adult prison in New York State, as a lifer, you are under the most onerous conditions. But he started running in prison, running around the yard, and he's now, in this November, will be competing in the New York City Marathon.
I suspect all eyes will be on him.
I suspect so.
So where does it go now? What kind of period of times you're now involved with suing? On a scale of 1 to 10, early settlement? No.
We have to see. One of the things that's good for us in this case is that the district attorney agreed to the exoneration. So the district attorney admits that he was innocent, basically. So that's going to go a long way, I think, toward trying to propel an early resolution. But you never know about these cases. We've been involved in wrongful conviction cases that settle quickly. Others, like the Central Park case, took over 10 years. The thing about Hugh Burton is that he seems to be so centered in his faith and in his sense of who he is and of giving back. He spends a lot of his time now giving back to groups like the Fortune Society that help prisoners, or the Innocence Project, speaking on their behalf. That we think he'll be fine, but we'll do everything we can to get as much as we can for him. But it will never be enough. It can never replace those lost years. And the horrible, the horrible thing that he had to contemplate all these years was that they believed that he would have killed his mother, and she died in a horrendous way, being stabbed in the neck twice, and left on her bed with her clothes, her garments over her head, as if to simulate a rape.
Yes.
Who lives with that? It's hard. But he's done as best as anybody could do, I think.
Yes. Were they ever able to find out who might have done this dastardly act?
Well, we have a suspicion that the Burton family had owned a 3-story building in the Bronx. Like a lot of immigrants, they moved to to parts in New York, saved them money, bought a building. We're renting out a couple of the apartments. They rented out an apartment to an individual and his girlfriend who we believe he was involved in the murder. He cooperated and helped steer the police toward Mr. Burton, and we believe that they, in a sense, conspired with the police to wrongfully prosecute Mr. Burton. And it turned out that this individual, whose name is Emmanuel Green. Hold on a second. Sorry.
Yeah, man, that's all right. This is okay.
I want to get his name.
Yes. This was in the Bronx.
Yes, this was in the Bronx.
And
It's not in here.
while you paper through that,
Anyway,
Yeah.
the individual who was accused had a record was on probation for rape. And, okay, if you're going to focus on somebody who's present at the scene, because when they got to the apartment, they were there along with the young Mr. Burton, the 16-year-old Mr. Burton. Why not focus on the person who's on probation for rape rather than a 16-year-old who's coming home from school?
yes,
Again, we have a generation. This is not a unique problem in the New York City Police Department. We had a generation of detectives and police officers who believed it was their mission to prosecute whoever they wanted, regardless of the evidence. And most of the time, they got away with it. There was a huge scandal in Brooklyn with the Officer Scarcelli and all his prosecutions. You have the Central Park case with the Manhattan North homicide, the cream de la cream of the NYPD that falsely convicted these 5 young men in the Central Park case. And you have this crew in the 47th precinct in the Bronx who, not only in this case, but in several other cases we've been able to document, got wrongful confessions from people of stuff that they didn't do.
Let me ask, as we come back to young Burton, then 16 years old, coming from school, the education side of things, was he able to get on with his life even through the prison system?
He ended up getting a GED in prison, but unfortunately, in that time as well, the state of New York decided that it was too much of an excessive benefit to educate prisoners, so they withheld any educational services from a lot of prisoners during that period of time. Many of which have been restored, but during that period of time, during the time he was in prison, from 1989 to 2010, he got his GED and that was it. So,
Yes. No, right.
but he survived prison by becoming a runner.
Okay, in a marathon. So we'll be
Marathon.
following up on this
So,
in November.
yeah, definitely.
All right, we'll take another break and we'll be right back. Most murders in Jamaica are committed by guns with the trademark Made in America. Yet nothing can be done to stem the flow. This is the next subject we discussed with our special guest, civil rights lawyer Jonathan Moore, while in the USA. Welcome back. We're talking to attorney at law Jonathan Moore out of New York. And there's a connection, of course. You've been to Jamaica many times, and we have discussed in the past the issue of the amount of guns, bullets, and their sources. This conversation goes on, but there's no resolution to it. Give me your sense of where this is going and where it can go.
Well, the proliferation of dangerous weapons, assault weapons, is not just a United States problem now. A lot of these weapons that are being bought and sold in the United States illegally, or illegally for that matter, are being shipped around the world, and a lot of them are showing up, for instance, in Jamaica. The New York Times just did an expose on this about how several tons of these weapons are showing up in the ghettos of Kingston and other areas in Jamaica, and so it's not now just a U.S. problem; it's a regional, if not an international problem, and it's part of the bankruptcy of our political system that, notwithstanding the fact that over 80% of the population wants strict gun controls, we are not able to get it because our politicians are too weak. They get too much support from the National Rifle Association and other individuals, other organizations, and the firearms industry spends millions of dollars every year, along with the NRA, to prevent any reasonable, rational regulations that prevent the spread of guns. So the problem gets worse. It doesn't get better.
We apparently have something in common. The Second Amendment and the interpretation thereof. And because of that, guns are easily accessible, and they end up in places like Jamaica, where it is the major tool of homicide, of murders, if you may. There's a strict interpretation of the Second Amendment, and Jamaicans have to become aware of the U.S. Second Amendment because of it, we have to react how we do, and we have to bury those who we have to bury. What's the interpretation of the Second Amendment that is creating the problem?
For probably 220 years of our republic, nobody interpreted the Second Amendment. Nobody. I mean, I'm talking no judge, no legal academic interpreted the Second Amendment as giving the right for individuals to bear arms. The Second Amendment, by its terms, says it permits a well-armed militia, but that's considered the sustaining the right of the state to basically have National Guards and that kind of stuff. It was never interpreted until a case called Heller versus District of Columbia, in an opinion written by Anton Scalia, an arch conservative, former now deceased Supreme Court justice. All of a sudden came up with this theory that the Second Amendment does give the right to bear arms, and it's now the law of the land, unfortunately. And so that's another impediment to reasonable, rational, sane gun control laws. But even with that individual right to bear arms, most jurists, even the most reactionary jurists, would acknowledge that there's a right, you still have a right to regulate who gets those guns and what kind of guns are appropriate to be used. So that's an ongoing debate. Hopefully, as we move away from the banality and the idiocy of the current political administration toward a more rational, sane form of government in our country, we will do the right thing and start really, putting the proper restrictions on the right to own and possess firearms.
We understand that under the President Clinton's administration, there was some movement as it relates to restricting certain types of firearms, but that ran out, the statute, if you may. What do you and what would you recommend that is done? Because we can always find a fault, but where is the balance?
Well, I think when people talk about regulations, I think most people talk about preventing access to weapons that are only used for war, which are the assault weapons, preventing access to magazines that feed hundreds of bullets at a time into a gun. You never need, that's not what people need for hunting or for personal protection. I mean, the argument has always been in the NRA is the symbol of the hunter out there, hunting for game or whatever as a sport, as a way of sustaining a way of living. But that's never involved the use of assault weapons. So there needs to be a ban on assault weapons. There was a ban that came in a place after, really going back to the Reagan administration, after one of his aides was killed, called the Brady Bill.
Yes.
And that was unfortunately allowed to lapse. That should be put back in place. There should be stricter controls in terms of who is allowed to purchase a weapon. We give a license to people to drive. We should give a license to people to own a weapon. And there should be stricter enforcement in terms of taking weapons away from people who have exhibited signs of instability or desire to hurt people, either because of mental illness, because of political extreme positions they take. And those are some of the things that could be done rationally, and it wouldn't take a huge effort to start, bringing a halt to this rampant
Yes. And,
epidemic of gun abuse.
because we've been counting several mass shootings, only recently in Texas again. A man just drives around and just shoots at people, in Texas. And it's just all over. And we have you in our prayers, and that's enough of it already, isn't it?
Well, no, it's not enough. It's not enough just to say afterwards that, our deepest sympathies go to you. We'll keep you in our prayers. That doesn't help. That's not a rational policy to deal with an epidemic. A rational policy to deal with an epidemic is to take guns out of the hands of people who are going to do harm, to make sure people don't get certain types of weapons. I would be in favor of a much more extreme prohibition on the use of weapons. But even if you grant that people have the right to have a personal weapon, a handgun perhaps, or a rifle or a shotgun, that should be the extent of it.
Yes.
There's no reason for why our citizens in this country or any country to be able to drive around with an assault weapon and just indiscriminately kill people. And the fact that they do it, and they do it every day. There's a mass shooting almost every day in the United States. Is a sign of a spiritual and moral decay in our society that we need to address.
Yes. Tell me, as it relates to a Jamaican administration government, if you may, are they able to say, let us sue these gun factories, these corporations, because the guns are made in USA, and every time I look at a shell that's stuffed out the life of someone, it said made in the USA.
Right. Well, no, they've been very, you got to credit the NRA and its supporters. They've been very thorough in their effort to prevent any kind of regulations. One of the things that they've done is have laws passed giving them immunity from being able to be sued for basically producing an inherently dangerous weapon. There is one case that's working its way through the system in Connecticut following the Sandy Hook mass shooting that they've survived motions to dismiss and claimed holding the gun manufacturers liable. Who knows where that will end up? If it survives trial and appeal in the state of Connecticut, I'm sure it will end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And given the makeup of this court, I wouldn't be optimistic that we'll get a good result. So I think it's going to be a generational thing. I think it will take several decades of getting more fair-minded jurists on the Supreme Court before we can really change this mad policy of allowing people to just own whatever they want.
We see the movement against these lobbyists by school children. Will that sustain itself? Will that make a mark? Will that impress anyone?
Well, it's certainly impressive. Again, I think it's a question of who you're appealing to. You're appealing to these people who have already taken contributions from the NRA and have already sworn their allegiance to the so-called Second Amendment as they interpret it. And so you have to wonder at what point does somebody who supports this kind of insanity, at what point do they stop and say, maybe I should take a second look? I just don't feel confident that they ever will. I think the only way we can get more rational legislation is to replace the people who are there now.
Okay. We'll take another break, and when we come back, we'll find out who is this man, Jonathan Moore. Our special guest on Insight, Jonathan Moore, civil rights lawyer from New York. Welcome back to Insight. Our discussions today with Jonathan Moore, attorney at law, New York, US of A. A little bit about you. People could easily describe you as some kind of a bleeding heart. Where do you fit? How close are you to a bleeding heart attorney?
Well, I'm not sure what that term means, but I know that one of the things I learned early on from my parents, who weren't bleeding heart. My father was a career military man. One of the things I learned from them is you treat everybody fairly and equally. You don't discriminate because of their race, their sex, their religion. We're all equals, and that's a lesson I've kept foremost in my mind as I've gone forward in my career now, 42 years in as a lawyer. It's always been as a civil rights lawyer. I was never a lawyer for corporations. I was never a lawyer for a business. I wanted to be and was able to become exactly what I wanted to be, which was a fighter for the people as a civil rights lawyer. And I continue to mentor new lawyers coming in. I teach at a law school in the city of New York, the CUNY Law School. I teach courses on government misconduct and civil rights to new lawyers coming up. So hopefully through my work and through being able to reach young law students and through the work of my firm, we're able to sustain this work as it goes forward, even after we're not on the scene.
How critical is the role for civil rights lawyers to be in on the system, and are they weakened often when they see these abuses? How does it tear at your heart?
Well, as former mayor of city of Chicago, Harold Washington, once said to me, he said, as a civil rights lawyer, you may not do well, but you do good. If you want to make a lot of money as a lawyer, you don't go into civil rights law. Most people are attracted to the big business. They've rigged the system so that you sort of have to go there because it's so expensive to go to law school. And by the time you get out of law school, you have a debt of $150,000, $200,000. So you have to go work for a big corporation or a big law firm in order to pay that debt off. And people always say, well, I'll just do it for a few years and then I'll go and really do the kind of work I want to do. And, after a few years, they're comfortable in their life and they won't even think about leaving. So, but we, over the years, lawyers like myself and others in different organizations continue to carry the torch, if you will, for civil rights. It's what, in my judgment, makes our system of government unique, that we have these individual basic liberties that are in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, that the government is not supposed to infringe. Now, they try to do it every day. They try to weaken it here and soften it there and chip away here. And our job is to make sure we keep that wall strong. Sometimes it's a little bit like putting your finger in the hole in the dike, but nevertheless, we carry on, we persevere. And over the years, if you look at in the last 50 years in the United States, the civil rights movement, there's been some significant developments, and that's come from having lawyers, civil rights lawyers, and these different organizations who are willing to take on these cases.
You alluded to your parents who really should treat people fairly. So let's go back to that journey. Where was this? Which state was this? Which school you went to? And give us the background.
Well, in some ways, my upbringing was unique because, as I said, my father was in the Air Force, in the military, and we moved around every 2 or 3 years. So I grew up in the East Coast, in the Midwest, in California. I grew up in Europe. So by the time I got to school, my last few years of college, I was in California, University of California in Santa Barbara. And from there, I joined VISTA, which was a program back in the day called Volunteers in Service to America, and ended up going to Chicago to do work, do welfare rights organizing, food stamp organizing, advocacy, and then a few years later went to law school. And so I guess my career path has always been one that's been directed at helping people, because at the end of the day, you look at yourself in the mirror and you say, am I happy about what I did today? Did I do something to make people's life better? I mean, you can't always answer yes every day.
Yes.
Wish you could, but for the most part, I look back and I say, after 42 years as a lawyer, I've been involved in some of the most important and significant civil rights cases. One that we haven't mentioned was the whole effort to combat stop and frisk in the city of New York.
Yes, tell us about that. That's interesting.
We after the killing of Amadou Diallo on February 4th, 1999, it became clear that the police department had a problem with how they were dealing with street encounters, particularly with people of color. We litigated we've been involved in this litigation now for almost 20 years. In August of 2013, we went to trial against the New York City Police Department. Nobody goes to trial in this kind of a case against an institution as large as the New York City Police Department. We did, myself along with Center for Constitutional Rights. We went to trial and we won a historic victory where the court found that the NYPD had maintained a policy of racial profiling in how they did street encounters, and that she declared that was unconstitutional, and she ordered that the department remediate the situation. So since 2014, we've been involved in developing programs and policies and guidelines and trainings that try to prevent police officers on the street from engaging in racial profiling. And as one testament to the success of our work, in 2011, the police department were documented almost 700,000 stops in the city of New York, which were about 88 to 90% of people of color, of which for which about 88 to 90% led to no further police activity. So they were, you could say that they were wrong
case of profiling
9 out of 10 times.
Yes,
And
yes.
now in the city of New York, at least documented, they're doing about 15 to 20,000. So that's certainly a huge difference. We think we've eliminated a lot of those unnecessary stops. We think there's still a problem. We think there are a lot of stops that aren't being recorded, so that they don't show up as a documented stop. So that's why we're continuing to work, and continuing to hold the police department's feet to the fire in this remedial process with the court to try to make sure that horrible period, which was really basically under Rudy Giuliani and Michael Bloomberg, that 20 years of unconstitutional policing never returns.
So this would involve the police just coming up to you, chances are, because you're a person of color, and just ask you for a search.
Tossing you. In the parlance of the police department, they toss you.
They do what?
They toss. TOSS. They toss you.
What does it mean?
That means they go up to you, they put you up against the wall, they search you, and if you got nothing on, they say, all right, go on your way. They never tell you why, they never tell you. They weren't respectful. in the process, and all it did was engender an incredible animosity between the community and the police department. And one of the reasons they did that is because within the police department, there were pressure on police officers to get numbers. There was a quota that was imposed on most officers in terms of the number of stops they had to do every tour, every week, every month, and if they didn't, they wouldn't get promoted. So they would go literally to cemeteries and take names off of graves and do stops. They go, they would go to the local playground and simply get the names of everybody playing basketball and do a stop. But it also involved, even though it was only for a few minutes, a encounter which you never knew whether it could turn deadly or not.
Yes.
And more importantly, it developed such animosity between the police department and the mostly people of color in our city, and that still exists today.
Yes.
They have not overcome it.
Let me just throw a quick one on you. Jamaicans looking on at the USA nowadays are a little bit nervous because of what they can't interpret the immigration policies. What's going on with that, and how do you assess what is happening as it relates to immigration?
Well, I'm no expert on immigration, but I can tell you one thing is that the message on the Statue of Liberty doesn't apply anymore, which is to give us your poor and your humble yearning to be free. We're not the same country we were 20 years ago, and it's unfortunate because we are a country of immigrants. At its root, the only non-immigrants are the Native Americans, and look what we did to them. So. The irony of this whole anti-immigrant movement is that we became such a fabulous, powerful, productive country because of immigrants, and now we're basically cutting that off. And it's based on primarily keeping people of color out of the country. Trump himself has said, I would like more immigrants from Norway. I don't want those rapist Mexicans or whatever you want, however in the ways that he describes them. So it's a horrible, horrible situation now on the border. And in part, people come to this country, particularly from Latin America and Central America, because they have countries there that don't respect their rights. We used to have programs to try to ameliorate the conditions there that would prevent people from wanting to immigrate. We don't do that anymore. And so, surprise, surprise, people want to come here.
Yes, at last, our time has run out, but the phrase that you have left me with is one that one gave you. You might not do well, but you'll do good. I thank you for your time,
You're
sir.
welcome.
And that's it for Insight Today. I'm Michael Sharp. Pleasant viewing.